This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream, and I really hope they feel like they got their money's worth on this one, because the saxophone solo that we're gonna be talking about today is really bad.
It sounds like if somebody ran a mile and was forced to breathe out of a saxophone. Sounded like a goose having sex.
It's from an alternative take of the 1956 song The Jones Girl by the Five Satins, and Twitter seems to have this recurring fascination with it. To be 100% honest, I also have a recurring fascination with it. It's really, truly atrocious. It's not very good at all. It's been called the worst jazz solo of all time. But what do we really mean by that? Can we quantify that in any kind of meaningful way? Can we use some kind of music theory analysis to explain its badness? Well, some people have tried. One article called it atonal, which just isn't true. Actually, atonality is the absence of tonal center, and in the recording, the saxophonist keeps playing the same note over and over and over again. It has a tonal center. A tonal center. Anyway, the same article claims that the solo is a pale imitation of bebop saxophonist Charlie Parker, which just is not true. In fact, the real history behind the solo and its musical lineage is a lot more interesting and, believe it or not, more nuanced. We are here today to try and figure out what makes a solo bad. We need to understand what it is we are listening to before we pass judgment. It's easy to make fun of something, but hard to come to grips with why exactly we do that.
Solo means I only have to play one note, right? It's not the notes he's playing, it's the notes he's not playing. You mean literally all other notes. Just have Jerry do the solo. Jerry only knows one note, he'll be fine.
So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable. We're here today analyzing the worst jazz solo of all time.
I gotta laugh at myself right now. I wrote that song called The Jones Girl, and I always thought it was a big time hit record, and it took 63 years for people to recognize its stunk.
This style of soloing, aggressively playing the same pitch over and over and over again on a 12-bar blues, can actually be traced back to a single recording, 1942's Flying Home by Lionel Hampton's band, featuring then 19-year-old saxophonist Illinois Jacquet.
The king of the vibroharp, the master of the drums, with his all-time big record of Flying Home, it's Lionel Hampton.
Flying Home was an enormous commercial success for Lionel Hampton's band and ushered in an entirely new style of saxophone playing which audiences went crazy for. It was aggressive, it was exciting, it was primal. Jacquet's frenzied style developed as a stark contrast to the fluid and dense and cerebral melodic improvisations of beboppers like, say, Charlie Parker. The school of Charlie Parker's playing was sophisticated and urbane. The school of Illinois Jacquet's playing was much more in your face. This style would culminate in a series of concerts known as Jazz at the Philharmonic. These were called a gladiatorial arena by jazz critic Norman Kranz because they would pit different saxophones together in what could only really be described as jazz battles. The ammunition that was volleyed back and forth in these jazz battles were things like multiphonics and altissimo squeals and incessant one-note passages. Yeah, man, jazz battles. We should have more jazz battles these days. Why is there no jazz battles? Come on. But like with any war, the soldiers in these jazz battles were the ones to pay the price. The incessant screeching, night after night after night on tour, was extraordinarily physically demanding, and Jacquet had to quit Hampton's band after just a couple of years on tour. Sometimes you have to quit to save your life. I looked in the mirror and said, "You're dying, and Hampton is getting rich." Physical demands and saxophone battle fatigue aside, the techniques that jazz musicians like Illinois Jacquet developed in the 1940s would go on to deeply influence the R&B musicians of the 1950s. Just check out Red Prysock playing on the tune Hand Clappin'.
Solo means I only have to play one note, right? Just have Jerry do the solo. Jerry only knows one note, he'll be fine.
That's just one note, played over and over again. That was an important part of the style in the 1950s, and there was probably nobody who better embodied the style of the R&B saxophone wailer than Big J McNeely. Yes, That is a glow-in-the-dark saxophone, and I want one. The avant-garde jazz saxophonist Ornette Coleman would say of McNeely, "I saw this big-looking guy, all dressed up in this fine-looking zoot suit, and he was honking one note over and over and over with one of the biggest saxophone sounds I'd ever heard." Ornette Coleman and the rest of the free jazz avant-garde borrowed very heavily from R&B saxophone technique. Just listen to the intense altissimo squeal of Big J. McNeely on the tune, "Real Crazy Cool." It's the same altissimo high C over and over again. The energy is just off the charts, but it is kind of uncomfortable. It might be a little bit hard to listen to. The note is rather out of tune. But nobody on Twitter seems to be making fun of Big J. McNeely. In fact, the exact opposite was the case whenever he played. Reactions among his audiences were frenzied, to say the least. Reactions like this one, where a woman seems to be headbutting his saxophone. The style and the technique of Big J. McNeely and the rawness that came with it is cut from the same cloth as Illinois Jacquet. It was a very popular sound, and it was bound to be imitated.
Solo means I only have to play one note, right?
My man Vinny that played the sax, he only had a couple of minutes to rehearse with us. So it wasn't like a thing of going over the songs that we did that particular session. So maybe 10 minutes we got together, and Vinny didn't know what the heck to do.
The Jones Girl solo can be attributed to Vinny Mazzetta, a local Connecticut saxophone player that helped the Five Satins arrange a recording session in the basement of St. Bernadette Church in New Haven, Connecticut. Now, there are other 12-bar blues solos that only use one note that are rather unartful, to say the least.
Like, for example, Brian Ferry's "Let's Stick Together."
Sorry to all the Brian Ferry fans out there, but Vinny Mazzetta's solo on the alternate take of The Jones Girl is especially unfortunate.
The solo is loosely built from a repetitive 2-bar pattern that centers around the tonic, the one. It doesn't repeat the same way every time, though. The first time that we hear the pattern, the second note is on the and of 2, and there's a little bit of a fall. But the second time we hear the pattern, that second note is actually on the downbeat of 3. The third time we hear it, Mazzetta adds a pickup note, but he doesn't articulate it very clearly. He doesn't tongue it, so the notes become slurred together in a way that's rather indistinct. This slurring effect continues as the solo picks up. More and more variations pile on, so even though it's very repetitive, the repetitions don't feel particularly intentional. All of the variations feel like Mazzetta doesn't have full control of his instrument, and whatever's coming out is just whatever he can play at the time.
So even though repetition does serve to reinforce musical ideas, that doesn't work when the repetition does not feel intentional.
Then there's, of course, the gigantic elephant in the room, the thing that people pick up on the most when they first listen to the solo, and that is Mazzetta's intonation. It is, shall we say, alternative. The Jones Girl itself is in the key of D flat, but by the time we get to the solo, Mazzetta is playing so sharp that it sounds like he's actually playing a D natural over and over again. But not quite D natural, it's almost there. If we want to be very specific, it's D natural if A was tuned to 432. So who knows? Maybe Mazzetta is just trying to get all the chakras in the band aligned, or maybe he's trying to ascend to a higher spiritual plane by playing that D at A432. Who knows? He can get away with this alternative intonation because there is no chordal accompaniment on The Jones Girl. There is no pianist and there is no guitarist. The Five Satins are a doo-wop group, and all of the harmonic information is coming from the vocal harmony, so by the time we hear the sax solo, there are no chords. As the solo progresses and the repetitions become more and more frantic, Mazzetta starts rushing out in front of the rest of the band, leading to a fairly awkward rhythmic moment where Mazzetta realizes that he is no longer in sync with the bass and the drums. It's at this moment where you can really hear the panic and Mazzetta's saxophone playing. He plays a couple of split tones, which is that growling saxophone timbre that's caused by overblowing on the reed. Split tones can sound really nice in certain contexts, but only when they feel intentional, and it certainly doesn't feel intentional here. When Mazzetta gets back on track and stops playing split tones and gets back together with the bassist and the drummer, he abandons his first rhythmic pattern and starts a new one, almost as if he forgot the one that he started with. The new one that he starts was featured prominently in Bill Haley and the Comets' Rock Around the Clock.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock.
There were many light swing tunes from this era that were 12-bar blues that featured one-note tutti sections. Fun word. You'd have a section of horn players playing the same rhythm, but with one note staying the same on top. Like, for example, Woody Herman's Woodchopper's Ball. These two songs were very popular in their day, and they were working with a ridiculously simple idea. You take the root note of whatever key you're working in, and then you just repeat it over and over again. Pop songs these days, am I right? Mazzetta and the Five Satins were a product of their time in the 1950s, and likely were well aware of the established tropes in the popular music of that time. They had a sense, right or wrong, of what might be popular.
It's the same note over and over and over again.
Yeah. I thought that was going to be the hit part.
So what happened?
In his book, The Listening Book, W.A. Matthew has this exercise. Pick a single note on your instrument or your voice, preferably mid-range at first. Make a short piece using only that note. Perhaps this one-note limit seems too austere or maybe too silly, but when you take it to heart, you will find an astonishing array of possible sounds.
I could, for example, play this G short, or I could play it long. I could play it loud. I could play it medium. I could play it soft. I could play it as a harmonic. I could pop it. I could slap it. I could play it here, or I could play it here for a slightly different sound. I could go back and forth between those two sounds, which is something called a timbral trill. Saxophonists love that idea. I could put horizontal vibrato on the note. I could put vertical vibrato on the note. I could put a lot of vertical vibrato on the note. I could bend up to the note. I could bend down to the note. I could play the note towards the bridge. Play the note towards the neck. I could play it with my fingernail. I could palm mute it with my right hand. I could mute it with my left hand. I could tap it here. I could tap it here. And of course, I can string these ideas together with different rhythms. And through rhythm, we can make musical statements that might be meaningful. Like, for example, I could do a call and response between two different timbres. I could play polyrhythms. I could play drum rudiments like paradiddles. I could let a harmonic ring while I play different rhythms on another string. The more you focus on this limitation, the more you realize there's actually a lot to explore.
The colloquial term one note usually is in reference to something one-dimensional, as in, I found the presentation very one-note and uninspired. But for practitioners of one-note solos, one note can be anything but.
I'm enormously inspired by Evelyn Glennie's solo snare drum performances. They're dynamic, they're exciting, and they're really, honestly, emotionally moving pieces of music. But because there's just one drum, you can kind of think of it as a form of one-note solo. You have this one sound source, so you can't rely on things like scales and melody and harmony to create musical interest. You have to really dig deeper and explore things like dynamics and tone color and, of course, rhythm. These things are fundamental in expressing musical ideas and, unfortunately, are often neglected by musicians, as well as people whose musical opinions should not matter.
There are three elements to music. There is harmony, there is melody, and there is rhythm.
Aw, isn't that cute? Ben's opinions on music are just so adorable sometimes.
There are three elements to music.
Now, there are modern composers who have explored these elements like tone, color, and rhythm through one-note music. Like, for example, the first movement of Hungarian composer György Ligeti's Musica Ricercata, which just kind of chills on the note A. The musical interest here comes from the rhythmic displacements as well as the shifting octaves. Sometimes you're hearing that A low, sometimes you're hearing it high. Rhythm is the primary motivator here. There is no melody, there is no harmony, just A. Sorry, Ligeti. Ben Shapiro does not consider you a musician.
That there's not a lot of melody and there's not a lot of harmony.
Musica ricercata.
Only fulfills one of these, the rhythm section.
Gotta pack it in, man. You're not a composer. Facts don't care about your feelings.
There are 3 elements to music.
You can also have one-note music that's not particularly rhythmic in its conception. Like, for example, the 7th movement to Elliott Carter's 8 Etudes and a Fantasy. It just kind of chills on the note G. The musical interest here comes purely from dynamics and the shifting tone colors as different instruments come in and out. It's very interesting. And it's also very interesting to compare how Western classical composers use the idea of one-note music with, say, how Big J. McNeely did. There are fundamentally different philosophical and aesthetic goals at play here, which lead to radically different artistic statements and radically different emotional states in the audience. If I was going to do a hackneyed analogy, which, let's be fair, is one of my favorite things to do, I would say that the woodwind quintet music of Elliott Carter is like a Mark Rothko painting. Severe, austere, minimalist, and rather foreboding.
Mark Rothko.
Whereas the music of Big J. McNeely is more like a strobe light, something that just punches you in the face over and over and over again with one note. There's a diversity of purpose and musical effect here. Mark Rothko and strobe light, Elliott Carter and Big J. McNeely, but they both used the same musical technique. So it's not really that useful to critique or analyze a piece of music solely based on cataloging the techniques used. That's not really enough to give you a full understanding of what's going on. Music theory without some kind of cultural or historical context just won't cut it. Yeah, we can say that the alternative take of the Jones Girl solo uses one note, but we have to dig a little bit deeper on what that one note means in context. In this case, it attempted to use a stylistic language that is altogether brash and arrogant. And it wasn't. Vinnie Mazzetta wasn't. He wasn't up to the challenge of speaking this language of arrogance with any degree of confidence, and so his solo comes across sounding weak and impotent. Big J. McNeely might sometimes sound like a screaming goat, but damn it, he is committed. And because he is committed, people respond.
Solo means I only have to play one note, right?
Playing the same note over and over again creates musical tension, even if that note is the tonic pitch, which is traditionally a place of rest. What you're doing is you're making the audience ask questions like, when is the note going to change? How will it change when it changes? Is the note going to change? What's going to happen?
In the case of the Jones Girl solo, none of those questions are answered. Mazzetta just stops playing 2 bars before the solo ends, and we're left with a rather awkward pause. Now, there are other musical traditions that use one note that have this arrogant brashness to them, like, for example, the tradition of the one-note rock guitar solo. Pete Townsend captures this kind of energy on The Who's I Can See for Miles. Neil Young is especially well known for this kind of solo, and you can hear it on his tune, Cinnamon Girl. In both the rock and the R&B traditions of one-note solos, the one that Mazzetta was attempting to emulate, there's almost a statement being made. It's almost as if saying, "F you, Yngwie, f you, Charlie Parker. What you need a million notes to do, I can do with just one note, and I can do it better." We cringe at Mazzetta's attempt because he can't do it better, which just goes to show that it requires a musician of incredible finesse and confidence to be able to play one note. It's not easy. So normally I try not to make fun of people if they're doing things in good faith, but yeah, it's funny. Mazzetta's solo is really bad, and it's comically bad, in fact. Comparing it to other musicians who did the same idea but better just underscores that fact. No, it probably isn't the worst jazz solo of all time. That honor would probably go to some bullshit that I played in freshman ensemble when I was in music school, but it's not good. It's really bad. It's kind of funny. In Mazzetta's defense, though, there are a couple of things that I do want to mention. The first one, and probably the most obvious, is that this was an alternative take of the Jones Girl, and it's probably a good reason why it was the alternative take. It wasn't very good. On the main version of the song, Mazzetta also takes a solo that has rather alternative intonation, but it's not nearly as bad. But another interesting wrinkle to this story is the fact that the Five Satins were not a no-name band. They saw commercial success in their day, and they continue to see commercial as well as critical success today in popular culture, just not on Twitter. And the reason for their commercial success comes from the exact same recording session that they recorded the Jones Girl and its alternative take, the so-called worst jazz solo of all time.
We came a long way as far as the song goes. It was just luck, I guess, and I like to say that since we recorded it in a church basement, it was blessed.
In the very same recording session in which the Jones Girl was recorded in the basement of St. Bernadette Church, the Five Satins also recorded their smash hit, In the Still of the Night, a doo-wop song that went on to sell over 1 million copies. Same band. Now, what's interesting is that it was recently featured in a Martin Scorsese film, The Irishman, and it also has a saxophone solo from Vinnie Mazzetta that has intonation that, shall we say, is less than perfect. But people on the internet have not made fun of In the Still of the Night, the same way that they did of the Jones Girl alternative take. In the context of The Irishman, the sound of the saxophone comes across as, well, a little rough around the edges, but maybe quaint, or nostalgic, or wistful. What that should tell you is that the way we interpret music, the way that we hear music, is often very, very dependent on context. On Twitter, we might mock it. On the big screen, we might consider it art. I mean, don't get me wrong, the saxophone solo on the Jones Girl is not very good. But the reason why it's not very good has little to do with the fact that it's one note. After all, musicians have been working within that limitation for a long time and have been able to create pretty amazing pieces of music. And it doesn't really have anything to do with the fact that it's kind of out of tune or it's not very rhythmically concise. What it really boils down to, at least in my opinion, is the fact that Vinnie Mazzetta is not really saying a whole lot. Big J McNeely and Illinois Jacquet simply say more with one-note solos. That's a hard thing to quantify, but it's also a hard thing to deny.
Like, how would we even begin to quantify that, right? If we started to look through all of the sheet music transcriptions of the solos that we listen to today, and we tried to find some kind of common thread which says this solo is good and this is bad, we'd come up entirely empty. Yeah, the Jones Girl solo only has one note, but so does Flying Home, and that was an international sensation. Yeah, the Jones Girl solo was rhythmically awkward and out of tune, but so was Real Crazy Cool by Big J McNeely, who inspired an entire generation of saxophonists. Yeah, the Jones Girl solo had inconsistent variations, but so did Hand Clappin' by Red Prysock. And that tune just sounds awesome. It's easy to reduce a critique to a soundbite. Solo bad because out of tune. Solo bad because one note. But as in anything in life worth doing, music is a little bit more nuanced than that. There are some things that we can explore in the so-called worst jazz solo of all time that might be worth our while. Like, for example, the idea of a one-note solo. There are contemporary one-note soloists that we could turn to here, like, for example, Leo P., who very much is continuing in the arrogant swagger tradition of Illinois Jacquet and Big J McNeely. Then there are others who take the more conceptual and textual approach of modern classical music, like, for example, creative YouTubers like Rob Scallon. But I would be remiss in this video if I did not at least mention the most famous piece of one-note music there is. I'm talking, of course, about Antonio Carlos Jobim's one-note samba, which, as you can tell, contains quite a bit more than just one note, but hey, that's besides the point.
What do I do here? It's nice and easy.
Yes, you're missing one note. E flat.
E flat?
E flat.
All right, lay it on me.
Ba, és aqui este sambinha feito numa nota só. Ba, outras notas vão entrar, mas a base.
The main musical idea of the one-note samba is to take one note, place it in the melody, and then move chords around underneath it. The shifting harmonic colors underneath that one note give that note new meanings every time you hear it. It's a remarkably effective idea. Harmony changes musical context.
What if we took Mazzetta's solo and changed the harmony underneath? How would that change the story being told? I'm curious. Almost as curious as today's sponsor, Curiosity.
So what's going on here? Well, let's do a quick harmonic analysis before we listen to the whole arrangement, which features a saxophone solo from Mr. Zach Zinger. You're going to want to stick around for that. When we take a one-note solo and place it within a harmonic context, what the one-note solo essentially is a form of pedal point. A pedal point occurs whenever you have the same note being repeated over and over again throughout a chord progression. And you hear the relationship of that note to the different chords in different ways. So, for example, over a D-flat major chord, that D-flat sounds like the 1. But over an F7 sharp 9 chord, it now sounds like a flat 13. It's a very different context. The chords that I chose all work with that pedal D-flat that's being repeated over and over again, the D-flat of the Jones Girl solo. So the first chord is a D-flat chord. D-flat does work with a D-flat chord. Imagine that. The next chord is a D-flat over F, and I often play an E-flat on first inversion major chords, so it's kind of like a D-flat add 2 over F, if you want to think about it that way. Next chord we have is G-flat add 2. That D-flat is like the 5 of the G-flat chord. Next chord we have is an A-flat 7 sus4, and that D-flat is the 4, the sus4. From there we have an F over A. We got that flat 13 D-flat right there. From there we have a B-flat minor 7, and the D-flat is the flat 3. From there we have an E-flat 7, and the D-flat is the flat 7. And then we're back to a G-flat major 7. From there, we go to an F7 sharp 9. That D-flat again is right there in the melody, pounding away into our skulls. That flat 13. We then go to a G-flat major 7 to a F over G-flat, which is an interesting chord. You could think of it as like an F7 chord with a flat 9 in the bass. Or you could also think of it as a G-flat diminished kind of chord, like with the major 7, that flat 5, which is the C, and then the flat 3, which is the A, and harmonic B double flat. From there we go to an A-flat sus2 to an E-flat over G. Again, I'm always voicing first inversion major chords with the 9, and usually in this quartal voicing in the right hand. From there, a G-flat add 2 to a D-flat over F, E-flat minor 7 to a D-flat over F, to an A sus4, which is a little strange because D-flat technically is not in an A sus4 chord. But if you have a C sharp on top, it actually doesn't sound that bad. So, whatever. And then finally, we get to an A-flat sus4, and that D-flat is the 4 of an A-flat sus4. Hooray! So a lot of chords, but they're all diatonic. They don't sound that strange. Maybe that A sus4 is the strange one, but honestly, it's not that bad. Arrangement-wise, I was kind of thinking Jackson 5-ish, I Want You Back. They often have like scratch guitar pedal point in those arrangements, those old school arrangements, and I thought that would work very well if I played guitar alongside the Jones Girl solo. The way the syncopation works in the Jones Girl solo, even if it's a little all over the place, it actually, as an idea, works pretty decently in this context. Anyway, I hope you enjoy my Jones Girl alternate take remix.
great solo, Zach Zinger, everybody. He did play more than one note, but we'll forgive him.
Peace.